on what is categorical data, and then we will introduce two tests, or depending on time. One is what we typically call the ChiSquare test, and then the other one is called Fisher's exact test. Depending on test, we will depend on if we have insufficient time. We will see if we have time to go to the third test, which is less frequently used, which is called McNemar's test for matched pair data. Okay, so what is categorical data? Categorical data refers to observations that only classified into categories that the data set consists of frequency counts for each different categories. And for example, if you have blood type, you have 4 different blood type, and you get a random sample of the individual, and then your data is organized by, like for each category of blood type, how many individuals have this blood type. So this example really gives you a typical setup of what we call by contingency table. Suppose we have a random sample, and in this random sample, we care about 2 things. One is their gender, and the other one is their hand preference. So we care about these 2 questions, whether it's a female or a male, and then whether they prefer to use left-hand side or right-hand side. So here, the data can pretty much be presented in this table, which is like 2 by 2 table, and then you have the number of individuals that both satisfies the row condition and also the column condition. And then you have this total, which is called the column total and the row total, and then the grand total. So this is a typical setup of a categorical contingency table. And after you have seen the setup, we can actually extend this a little bit, that it doesn't have to be 2 by 2. It doesn't have to be 2 categories or, like in the rows and in the columns. It really can be any number of categories. So for example, we have here the meal plan selection by the 200 total students, which fall into the 4 grade of classes. So we have fresh students, we have sophomore, we have junior and senior, and then they have 3 choice of their meal plan. So this one, by setup, it's actually a 4 times 3 table that gives you the different setup, the different numbers that within each class and each plan selection. So essentially, for categorical data, it can be n times k or k1 times k2, any arbitrary numbers of categories. So contingency table is useful in situations involving multiple population proportions. It's used to classify sample observations according to 2 or more characters. So here, although we said in each categorical data, it doesn't have to be 2 levels of categories. But here, when you have a table, by default, you have 2 data or 2 characteristics. You have either the class standing or their meal plans. If you have a third variable, then you need to have either a 3-dimensional table, or you need to have another layers of tables that parallel to this. So essentially, if you have a table, the number of variable that you're talking about is 2. And for each variable, the number of categories can be more than 2. So this is something that intuitively you need to remember. And then contingency table sometimes also refers to as a cross-classification table. So we talk about, I'm sure you have heard about ChiSquare test quite often. This is probably one of the very popular or very frequently used statistical tests that in your research. And so here we are going to spend some time to talk about what is exactly a chi-square test. And by the setup of our previous lecture, now you understand that whenever we talk about a hypothesis testing technique, there are several key elements. So for chi-square tests, there are several key elements that you need to understand or you need to know after you finish this lecture. The first of all, for any hypothesis test, first of all, what is this test for? What is the null hypothesis? What is the alternative hypothesis? Right? And then second of all, what is the rationale for this test? How do you construct a test statistic for this test? And then third of all, what is the reference distribution that once you calculate that statistic, what is the reference distribution that you can get a critical value that you compare to? So those are the three fundamental things for any hypothesis testing. Like we talked before in the previous slide, in the previous review section, essentially for one sample t-test or two sample t-test, you always need to know that first of all, what is the alternative? What is the null hypothesis for this test? What it's used for, right? And then second of all, what statistic do you calculate? Like t-test, that's a t statistic. And how do you calculate that? And then third of all, what is the reference distribution that you compare to? So those are the three key fundamental things for any hypothesis testing. So until here, I hope you understand that if we are going to introduce a new test, for example here, chi-square test, those are the three things that we are going to concentrate on. So what is the first fundamental question? What is this test for? So chi-square test is used to test for one question, and this question really is whether the row and the column are independent or not. And if you have a two variable or if you have a contingency table, how does that translate into numbers? Which means if you will put that in the previous setting where you have female and you have male and you have right and left hand choice, what does that mean? That essentially means that the proportion of females who are left-handed is equal to the proportion of males who are left-handed. Essentially, you can see that the other way as well. You can see that the proportion of left-handed is the same for female and male. So essentially, when you talk about the concept of the hand choice is independent from gender, in statistics, there is a one-step translation. It essentially means that whether this row choice is the same, like whether for each column, the probability that they choose different rows is the same across different columns. Because if they are the same, that means whether you are female or you are male really has nothing to do with your preference of using right hand or left hand. So essentially, conceptually, that means the gender is independent from the preference of hand choice. So this is a very key translation of chi-square test, because chi-square test, essentially or conceptually, we always talk about that chi-square test whether the rows and the columns are independent for your contingency table. But in terms of number, what exactly does that mean? That really just means that for each column, the probability of choosing each row is the same across the different columns. And then you can put the other way around as well. For each row, the probability that falls in within different columns is the same across rows. So here, because we have just 2 categories in each level, in each variable, so essentially it says that we can simplify that into P1 and P2. And P1 stands for the proportion of male who are left-hand, and P2 stands for the proportion, no, P1 stands for the proportion of female who are left-hand, and P2 stands for the proportion of male who are left-hand. So essentially, if you look at this table, P1 is among all the females, proportion of female who are left-hand. So essentially, P1 means among all the left-hand people, what is the proportion of female? So for this column, what is the proportion of the first row? And then P2 means for this column, what is the proportion of the second row? Okay? So if they are the same, which means the genders really has nothing to do with hand preference. And let's see. So I don't want to go to the details of ChiSquare test. How do we set up a ChiSquare test? Because for next lecture, we will spend some more time on that. But essentially, I want to give you an idea of what is ChiSquare test. ChiSquare test, it basically, it tells you, it is the difference between expected and observed. And expected, what is expected? That is really the expected number or the expected layout under the null hypothesis. And the observed is what you actually observed. So essentially, ChiSquare test is a summation of all the cells, the square distance between the expected and observed over the expected. So O here stands for observed, and E here stands for expected. So during the next lecture, what we are going to talk about is, so here you have the observed, which is different numbers that falls into different category. Essentially, for ChiSquare test, what you need to do is you need to do a parallel table, and this table is called expected table. And this expected table gives you different numbers of different cells, and that has difference between this observed number. And ChiSquare test essentially is the summation of the square distance between every 2 numbers here, every pair of numbers here. And the key is, how do you calculate the expected table? And we will leave that to the next lecture. So this concludes what we are going to talk about today. And I do want to make a comment here is, so Pam is here, and so for this lecture, I mean, this is actually the first experience that I teach this lecture that without a companion, section on R. Because typically what we do is, whenever we introduce every test, hypothesis testing, or every estimation, we have a companion tutorial on R that tells you how do you do those, let's say, how do you do ANOVA in R, and how do you generate that ANOVA table, and how do you read the R output, so in order for you to use that. For this lecture, I understand that you use Python. So I think that's the same, essentially, because as long as you understand how to use those, you can still use that to, generate the same output like R. So that, I will leave that to Pam, and I believe she will cover all of those in Python. But for your homework or for your own research, most of the homework, you can calculate by hand. But what is essentially for you and also beneficial for you is, I hope you have some kind of knowledge of how to do those in a statistical software. Either it's Python or R that you can perform that in the software. because eventually, I mean, you probably cannot use Excel or cannot use your calculator to do all those tests along your research. So keep in mind that what you have learned here is really the fundamental theoretical sense, but you need to pair that with your TA on the tutorial that you need to know how to implement that in a statistical language. That's it.